Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be doing something kind of interesting and kind of adventuresome as we go through a very unscripted session with participants here. We've got a full room of people from all across the country. And so it's going to be a little bit of an experiment, but we're looking forward to the opportunity. Again, my name's Robert Nordland, been with Association Reserves now it's our 26th year in business, so we've got a bunch of experience under our belt in this. But the question is, what actually are we doing? And what's it look like in the process of preparing these reserve studies? We thought we'd do this kind of open session as a bit of a new series of actually working with a project manager and looking over and seeing what actually goes on and putting these principles into actual practice. So today we're going to pretend that we're all together in a room, and you'll have a question dialog box near the bottom right of your screen. It should be a dialog box that looks something like this. And if you have a headset and a microphone, we'll give it a test of actually unmuting you and having an ongoing dialogue. So let's do that test right now. If you have a headset or an ability to speak into your computer, why don't you give me a hands raised, and I'll practice by calling on somebody and see if we can get them. Charlene. Say hello to everyone, Charlene. Okay, Charlene must be having technical difficulties. How about going down the list? Let me try someone else. Anyone else with a headset? Leonard.
Yes, I'm here again.
Hello, Leonard, and tell everyone what state you're from.
Washington State, and it's raining.
Oh, we had rain last night here in California. So everyone, that's how it's going to work. If you have a question, raise your hand, and Chris will be moderating, watching over this, bringing your attention to the forefront. And if you don't have the ability to speak to your computer, if you don't have a headset, then you can just type in your question into the chat dialog box. So, without further ado, here we go. Let's talk about this one sample property. Sample property today is 56 units, 16 buildings. It's a townhouse-style property, one pool, one clubhouse. It was new in 1972, so it's 40 years old. This is a Southern California property, and one of the first things we do is just try to get organized. What are we trying to accomplish here at this property? We often get a map of the property, something 8.5 by 11, and get oriented. So the first thing we do here is quite often color code the map to see what's going on. You can see I've color coded carports as this purplish color, pools in blue. Always have to do the pool in blue. Residential buildings are kind of an aqua, clubhouse is an orange, and the asphalt, it's actually purple, but you can see they've got public streets coming into this association and private asphalt for their 1, 2, 3, 4 driveway areas. So that's the association we're going to be talking about today. As an overview, we do our site inspection a little bit differently if it's a full reserve study or a with site visit update. The case that I'm going to walk through today is a with site visit update. So I came with measuring tools with me, but not with an expectation to spend the whole day remeasuring. This was just an update. We've done this reserve study actually a number of times before. But what's it look like? Let me give you a flavor. Like I said, 16 residential buildings, standalone carports, wood structures. Carports are flat roof construction. The buildings are stucco with some wood siding, some trees, significant fencing around the property. Another view. The asphalt, being a property about 40 years old, has been around since inception, so it's original asphalt. You can see it's showing its age. It's been sealed and crack sealed many times. And the siding is getting close to the end of its life. You can see deterioration and the fibrous nature of the siding here. It's starting to fray a little bit. And a significant item here at this association is the fencing. Currently it's wood fencing. They're considering going to a Trex, a non-wood, or a synthetic substitute, maybe even a hardy board. You can see the fencing throughout the property is cracking, it's splitting, it's warping, it's becoming a little bit unstable. So the fencing here is definitely old and showing its age. This is a view from the roof looking down. You can see there's private patios, so a lot of linear feet of fencing all throughout the property. The roof itself is in pretty good shape. They had the roof resurfaced or redone just a few years ago, so it's in good condition. A little bit of tree debris getting hung up in the roof. Most of the roof doesn't have gutters, and so they're not worried about that extra asset. And then the carport roofs, as I said, are a flat material. So we have shingles on the residential buildings, flat roofs, or low slope roofs, I should say technically, for the carports. And in addition, they have a little clubhouse, nice little building, remodeled I think about 10 years ago. So it has a nice tile floor surface, but very simple. It has seen better days as far as use. It's rarely used at this point in time. Just the nature of the changing demographics and style of usage there at the association. But it's pretty clean, pretty good shape, but largely unused. So the question is, what do we do at this point in time? Well, the first thing that we do with any reserve study is deal with the component list. The component list is the foundation of the reserve study. It's basically the basis point. If you're thinking about a pyramid, it's the starting point that everything else is built on. After that, we'll calculate the reserve fund strength. And finally, the last step is dealing with a reserve funding plan, actually looking at what components there are, identifying based on the strength their starting point financially. Now the third part is the funding, and where do we go from here? How much do they need to be setting aside towards reserves? Now an interesting part of this is that, remember, the component list is what in a site inspection based reserve study I'm out there actually looking at. So the reserve fund strength and the funding plan are calculated on the basis of that component list. Now in a no site visit update, we're updating the reserve component list on the basis of time that has elapsed, interviews with vendors, things like that. But in this with site visit reserve study update, I actually went out to the property. And one other concept I need you to understand is that these first two parts of the reserve study are disclosures, whereas the funding plan is a recommendation for action. And that'll come pretty clear later on as you see how this all starts to come together. The component list is a disclosure on the current state of the association. Reserve fund strength, also a disclosure to all the members how well the association is prepared financially for its own future. And then the funding plan is what action we're going to recommend the association actually take. Now fortunately, we're not alone in this. In our field, as in so many other fields across the country, there's National Reserve Study standards. So there's national standards guiding how we do a reserve study. It's not just the association reserves way of doing things versus brand X. There are national standards that we adhere to, we follow, that has the very positive benefit of giving clients a standard set of terminology, and when they move from one building to another or one association to another, they actually are able to understand what a reserve study created in Florida means when they move to California or when they move to Washington, because it's national standards, national terminology, and a consistent expectation for what's going on across the board. So, what do those national standards say? Well, in the case of a reserve study, we're not going out to a site and comparing against a magic checklist. National Reserve Study standards indicate that we are to create a reserve component list based on a 4-part test. And if a component meets this 4-part test, if all 4 questions are answered yes, then it is appropriate for reserve funding. So those 4 questions are, number 1, is it a common area maintenance responsibility? Is it life limited? Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? And is it above a minimum threshold cost? So let me go backwards. And let's look at this clubhouse. There's possibly a number of different things here. Painting the interior. You see some lights on the ceiling, some bare minimum furniture, and some tile flooring. We could craft line items for each of these individual elements, but it's not wise because we run into that 4th part of the test. Is it above a minimum threshold cost? And so we tend to, in a simple situation like this, coordinate the projects together for a remodel type of line item. And let me now...
Excuse me, Robert.
Yes.
Eric has a question for you. Eric, would you like to ask Robert your question?
Eric, go.
Hello.
Hello, Eric. We have you. Tell us what state you're from.
We can hear you, Eric.
Oh, you can?
Absolutely.
Okay. I typed in my question, but what really constitute, or what criteria? I know you were just pointing out the criteria on what constitutes each of the major components to be added to a reserve study. So,
Eric, so it's that 4-part test. As I look around here, I see a number of different things, and I'm looking for assets that are a common area maintenance responsibility. Are they life limited? Does it have a predictable remaining life? And above a minimum threshold cost. Even in this picture, I see the concrete pad that the cars park on. After 40 years old, I saw stability with this, essentially no deterioration. So it's very clear to me that it would be inappropriate to fund for the concrete pad. But they're already on their, I think, 3rd carport roof and their 2nd shingle roof. Obviously, they paint every few years. So I'm looking with that 4-part test as I'm looking around the association. Does that help?
yes, it is. Thank you.
Great.
We have another question, Robert, from H. Peter.
Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Okay.
Peter, tell us where you're from.
I am from Maine, but I am the treasurer of an association, a condo association in Hawaii, at the other extreme end of the country.
We've got people from everyone today. How can we help?
My question, and it may not be appropriate given what you're just covering, I am concerned about the, we just had you do a study, and we were extremely pleased with it.
Peter, I didn't hear that. Can you say that again, please?
Yes, we just had you do an extensive study of our complex, and we were extremely pleed with it, but
Peter,
it raises a question.
Peter, I was just only kidding. Thank you so much. Kind words.
Okay, and I thought you would be, and I thought you might, and if necessary, I'll repeat it a 3rd time, especially if that gives us a discount next year.
Got it. Okay, we'll see how much time we have left at the end.
Okay. You may want to postpone this question or deal with it at a different forum. But the the way I see it, and I have a projection of our reserve funding in front of me, and what appears to happen is that, let's say we repair our roof, we redo our roof next year, and let's say we have a reserve of $300,000 for that. Next year we pay the $300,000 for the roof, and that item disappears from our reserve funding, obviously, but we put into the future reserves the full amount of the roof in 25 years that has to be redone in 25 years. Say by that time it's at an estimated inflation of 3.5%, the cost has risen to $1 million. Right. So clearly, if we put that $1 million into next year's or the year after's funding requirement, our funding rate will drop way down. And what I have tried to do as an alternative, and I wonder if that is a valid method of doing it, is that whenever an item is being done and therefore disappears for this year from the reserve account, I replenish the funding requirement with, if it's a 30-year item, with 1/30th of the future cost. If it's a 5-year item, with 1/5, and the next year the 2/5, and the year after the 3/5, so that I am treating the funding requirement as arising year by year and as growing year by year, rather than having the 30-year roof put in, the full funding requirement put in the year after I've done my roof. Do you understand? Do I make myself clear?
I believe so. Peter, I will get to that in just a few minutes when I get to the funding analysis. So let me wrap up the doing of the creation of the inventory, and I think you're going to provide a great segue to the actual financial analysis, okay?
Okay, no.
So I'm going to mute you and wrap up the creation of the inventory. Here we go. All right, so I've gone around the property. At this place, since we have measured everything, we did just a little bit of adjusting. At this association, their patio furniture, I'm going to make this a little bit larger so everyone can see. The patio furniture around the pool had been something they were doing a piece here, a piece there, and they realized that was not successful. They were having a real mishmash of things, and so they wanted to get a whole new set, which they did the week after I was there. So that, for their upcoming fiscal year, will be 1 year old. So that's one adjustment that added to the reserve component list. Another addition to the reserve component list was the railroad ties. They have some low garden wall type areas adjacent to the walkways. They had been doing some minor maintenance and repairs to that through the operational budget and realized they were just plain getting behind, so they needed a railroad tie replacement line item in their reserve study. And backflow devices were in the prior reserve study as a funded component, but they now have a landscape maintenance company that is maintaining those on an ongoing basis. And so the nature of a with-site visit reserve study update is not so much that the quantities will change, but you'll get some good decision points as the association changes vendors and as different projects actually get accomplished. You can see here that they finished rebuilding their carports. They did their wood carport structures as a two-phase project on a 15-year basis. They did half of them 1 year and half of them this year. So half of them 2 years ago, half of them this year, and they expect to redo those again in the future. So it's an update to the useful life factor, remaining useful life factor. Are we funding it through reserves, so the operating account? All those types of things, the adjusting and tweaking to bring it current. So after we get the components together, and actually let me point out one more thing. You'll see that there's a few line items here that we're not funding. Concrete swales and the little air conditioner in the rec building. We have itemized these. We're showing them that we saw them in our actual detail, and I will go to that. In our actual detail, there we go. Here's the little wall air conditioner on the outside of the little rec building. It's a small enough unit that they should expect to repair or replace it as needing using operational funds. No need for reserve funding at this time. So we're showing it for completeness, but this is an example of an asset that failed the four-part test, or the fourth part of the four-part test. So we're trying to be complete, but indeed we're only funding for assets that meet all four parts of the National Standard Reserve Component Test. Okay, so we're being nice and complete here, showing things, but only the line items with numbers attached to them will make it into the financial analysis. So that's where we'll go now. You can see that I'm now in a number crunching piece of software. It's our financial analysis software, where we have the reserve component list. The railroad ties I spoke about, the patio furniture that is now being funded, all these line items show here, and this is how we do the two different things. First is to calculate the fully funded balance, and the fully funded balance is simply the proportion of funds needed at this point in time based on the deterioration. When an asset is completely deteriorated, as in the asphalt seal project, the fully funded balance equals the current cost. So it's just a simple proportionality. The fully funded balance at this association at this time is $934,000, and since they only have $232,000, this association is 24.9% funded. And let me give you some framework for what that actually means. Go back to our
Robert.
PowerPoint. Yes.
Joanne had a question. Are the CC&Rs reviewed in establishing the component items? Because many studies have components that are not an obligation of the associations. Can you elaborate?
That's a great question. It illustrates the first part of the National Standard four-part test. Our company reviews the governing documents the first year of an engagement with the client. We don't review governing documents in subsequent years, as they very rarely change. But indeed, you should only be funding things through reserves that are a common area maintenance responsibility. I could go back a few pictures. Let's see if I can find something that's private property. Yes, here in the backyard, private property, it looks like a barbecue that's covered by tarp. We should not be funding for anything that's private property. We're not. It's just plain the association's. It's not the association's responsibility. Okay. So that's our style. We review the governing documents first time we have an engagement with the client. Fully funded balance is a calculation that's done, summed for all components, and that gives us the percent funded, which is an evaluation of reserve fund strength. 100% funded is when the association has the funds on hand equivalent to the amount of deterioration. Not the total replacement cost, but just the amount of deterioration that's happened so far. You can imagine that when the association's reserve fund is small compared to the amount of deterioration, that's when they have special assessments. Yes, I have that chart. This is the special assessment risk. So based on your percent funded, you know that when you have relatively little reserve cash on hand based on the needs of the association, your special assessment risk is high. And here's the national profile across the country. As I think Peter reminded us, Maine to Hawaii, most associations are generally in the fair range. with a number in the strong range and an unfortunate number down in the weak range. And this is how we communicate the summary of this. If your association is in the 0 to 30% range, you have on average a 37% chance of special assessment just due to not having much cash there at the association. So after we've completed the component list and calculated the reserve fund strength, then the next question is, where do we go from here? Well, let me point out an interesting statistic here. And this is something that we look at in the reserve study. We call it the significance. It's how much cash is needed by each different component. And so when I look at this, I scroll down and I see classically asphalt is about 8 or 9% of the total. I scroll on down, painting is usually a significant chunk. 6% for the fence, 17 plus 2 is at 13, about 30% of the reserves are going to painting. Roofing is classically a large item. Carport roof and the shingle roof were up better part of 20%. But look at here. At this association, the wood fence is tremendously significant, 14% of the total. Most other line items really truly are background. Looking here, 1, 2, 3%. The large ones are the classic 3 plus fencing. So that's just one thing that we look at. You can see the array of expenses here. We had one, a block wall repair that was expected to occur every year. And I think you can read it at this resolution. You can see how it's gradually getting larger and larger with inflation. Let's see, you can probably see it a little clearer with the asphalt seal project that occurs every 4 years. It goes from $6,900 in the first year to $7,800 as it inflates 1, 2, 3, 4 years into the future. Well, I want to do a little illustration here. I've got a sheet here that shows what happens with straight line funding versus cash flow funding. That's typically a popular question. So if I take the average cost here in that first line item, concrete steps and sidewalk repair is something this association wants to do every 10 years. Average cost is $7,000. Do it every 10 years. The contributions are $700 a year. And so we get an annual contribution of 74 grand or a monthly contribution of 6,000. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't appreciate, or that doesn't acknowledge that the association has, and hold on, I'm going to flip through a couple of things here. Association has $334,000 worth of projected expenses this year, and if you remember, they started out at $230,000. So starting with $230,000, you're not going to be able to spend the $334,000 unless you have significantly more than the very simple straight line calculated reserve contributions, $6,000 per month here. So we could do a couple other tweaks to it.
Robert, I have a couple of questions here.
Sure.
Okay, Michael would like to know, how is the minimum cost portion of the 4-part test estimated?
Michael, I like that question. The minimum cost varies with each association. As you can see here, the smallest cost item they have here is they expect it to be between $500 and $750. The lower threshold at this association, we agreed it was going to be $500. Nothing smaller than that, because the manager's signature authority and the board member's signature authority was both $500. They could, on their own recognizance, on their own authority, spend things up to $500, and so you didn't need to dip into the reserve fund for anything less than $500. Typically, it's a manager or board member signature authority, or somewhere in the 0.5% to 1% of the association's annual budget. Either one of those two tests will give you a good starting point to help you keep trivia out of the reserve study. Chris, second question?
Mary would like to know if you could name the classic 3 components you mentioned.
Oh, I'm sorry, I went through that fast. Classic 3 components are roadway surfaces, painting projects, and roofing projects. Those are the classic 3 with townhome and the mid-rise condominiums. That changes a little bit as you get to high-rises because they don't have so much roofing, but they have a lot of major mechanical and interior components like hallways, carpeting, wall covering, things of that nature. But the classic 3 for a townhome type condominium are roofing, painting, and roadway surfaces. I went through that rather quick. So it's interesting in this one that their wood fence is so significant. But you saw they have stretches of wood fence around every single patio. So there's a lot of it there. Okay, let me get back to this. There's some significant cash flow issues that this association has. And so if we address the cash needs of the association, then you find out that their contributions need to be about $30,000 a month. And if I do a little bit of optimizing and putting the existing $230-some-thousand worth of reserves in strategically the right pockets, I can get that contribution rate down to $19,753. But let me show you something that it's all about. The funding really is moving money where you want to be, when you want to be. National Reserve Study Standards gives us some guiding points. We want to have sufficient cash. It needs to be fair. It needs to be spread evenly across the ownership base, and it needs to be safe, not in a risky situation. So the straight line is method is a lot of buckets. It's the roof bucket, the paint bucket, the asphalt bucket, into which you pour money, and then each one of these will grow individually. So there's carport money, and you're saving carport money for a carport project. Now there's a couple of weaknesses with this. So depending on the needs, you may want to reallocate the funds from one year to the other. Okay, in this association, they need money for asphalt and fencing. So I'm going to go backwards here. They took money from the roofing in the clubhouse and put it into asphalt and fencing. And so you're moving money in the straight line philosophy to where you need it. And if you do that, then all of a sudden you realize there really is no such thing as true asphalt money or fencing money. It's all going towards where it needs to be. And so that has evolved into spreading the money evenly across all components and taking out the dividers. And so it is just plain reserve funds available for use for the reserve needs of the association. And that's where we get the word a pooling concept. The reserves are there. They're there to be used for the scheduled reserve projects. And that's philosophically how the funding occurs. Now let me get back to the actual numbers. So you saw the straight line method can bounce us around because it's tightly holding on to reserve dollars for roofing or painting or the patio furniture or different things. But if we go to a cash flow basis, and again hold on here, let's try a few different things. With contributions of $9,000 a month, which is a nice low number, and I'll give them a nice even special assessment, although I'm not sure any special assessment can be called nice. But you see the expenses here. That cost for fencing in the initial year significantly strains their reserve balance, and so they do need a special assessment to get through that first year. But once we get through that first year with a $1,250 special assessment, I can design a nice, smooth funding plan that gets them fully funded, which is the objective of any straight line method. But I can do it with the cash flow method with $9,000 of contributions per month instead of some of the choices that straight line calculations gave us, $19,700 or $30,000 a month. So I'm a very strong advocate of the cash flow method. Now let me do a couple of things here just to play around with the numbers. This analysis, as I think you saw, is being driven significantly by the pressing needs of the association to pay for their wood fence. So let's change a couple of numbers here. I don't advocate this for your association because your reserve study truly is a disclosure and you need to report truthfully the physical situation there. But just to show you how the numbers work, let's pretend that the fence is 5 years away and they have committed to replacing it with Trex, some nice non-wood material that's going to last 30 years. Now let's take a look at some of our options. You see the immediate cash needs of the association has gone away. I pressed that expense a few years into the future. And let's just try a couple of things. We can fully fund the reserve needs of the association. It bounces around. I'm going to show you the percent funded. It bounces around, finally getting into the strong zone after 5, 10, 15 years with just contributions of a little under $10,000 in the first year and just gradually floating upward with inflation. And a critical thing for you to understand is that if we want to just baseline fund, if you don't want to be fully funded, if this association wants to know, Robert, what's the minimum contributions we can put towards our reserves and still be cash positive, it went down to a little over $9,000 per month. So it varies between let's call it $9,600 and $9,000 a month, and that difference is about 6 or 7% going on my calculator here. So it's an important finishing lesson here is that the difference between barely funding your reserves and becoming fully funded is often a very, very small number. And in this case, it's only 6 or 7% difference in the size of your reserve contributions. The minimum reserve contributions to barely stay above zero is a little over $9,000, and to be fully funded is about $9,600. So that's a quick illustration of the funding plan, the choices we have. I'm a strong advocate of cash flow method, pushing our association clients towards being fully funded and advising them to stay away from baseline funding. There's the lower reserve contributions are not significant, and they drop the association into special assessment risk that just isn't worthwhile. So let me get back onto the PowerPoint, and I'm about at time, and so hopefully these are some of the tools that you see that we use on an ongoing basis to help your association stay looking sharp and to give you success with keeping your property values at a maximum and hopefully your board meetings at a peaceful length where you have the cash to do what the association needs to accomplish. So Chris, at this point in time, do we have any final questions to wrap up with?